Hi, this is Lee, and wanted to talk about some common misconceptions related to bills in the California legislature. The first misconception is that only urgency statutes take effect immediately. Under Article 4, Section 8C3, statutes calling elections, statutes providing for tax levies, statutes providing for appropriations for the usual current expenses of the state, and urgency statutes go into effect immediately upon their enactment. Urgency statutes are generally those considered necessary for immediate preservation of the public health, peace, or safety, and those require approval by 2/3 vote of both houses under Section 8D of Article 4 of the state constitution. Note that under Section 12E1 of Article 4, the budget bill and bills providing for appropriations related to the budget bill may be passed by just a majority vote to take effect immediately. Also, tax levies, except tax increases, require a majority vote, and statutes calling elections require a majority vote. So quite a few of those measures only require a majority vote as opposed to an urgency statute that requires a 2/3. Another misconception is both the Assembly and Senate permit their members to introduce a maximum of 40 bills per session. That was true up until the 2017-18 California legislative session, when the state assembly changed its rule to allow a maximum introduction of 50 bills per session. That's found in Assembly Rule 49A. The Senate retains its cap of 40 bills per session. Now, of course, members in either house can request a waiver from their respective committee on rules to introduce more than the maximum allotment. Another misconception is that a bill that's been keyed by Leg Council as a tax levy is a tax increase. However, a tax levy bill, to be so designated, requires a change in the rate, burden, or benefit. And it can be anything from imposing a tax, repealing a tax, or materially altering a tax. In any of those instances, a bill is designated by the Legislative Council as a tax levy, and you can see that in the bill title, the Legislative Council's digest as well. Another misconception is that all bills that contain an appropriation require a supermajority vote for passage. Now, that is a general rule, except for education finance bills that are majority vote. Special fund appropriation bills also require just a majority vote. And of course, the budget bill junior, and trailer bills, budget trailer bills that have an appropriation in them require a majority vote. So other than the budget related bills, if a bill contains an appropriation from the general fund, then it is a 2/3 vote requirement. Another misconception is that all 2-year or carryover bills can be considered at any time in the second year of the 2-year legislative session. However, under the state constitution, a 2-year bill, which the constitution calls a carryover bill, even those, for example, that contain an urgency clause or are a tax levy, they still have to pass their house of origin by January 31st of the second year. Note that this rule does not apply to constitutional amendments. Another misconception is that, like in the US Congress, the sponsor of a bill is the legislator who introduces that bill. In Congress and a vast majority of states, the bill's author is termed the sponsor of the bill. But in California, the sponsor can be the member of the legislature, a private individual, or any group that develops a measure and brings it to an author requesting them to introduce that measure and carry it on behalf of that sponsor. In California, the member of the legislation who introduces the measure is called the author of the bill. Another misconception is that only bills cross the desk upon their introduction. However, all legislative measures must be put across the desk upon their introduction. As well, proposed amendments must be put across the desk in the Assembly or Senate in order to be considered for adoption as well. Another misconception is that bond measures are approved only by the legislature. A bill authorizing the sale of state general obligation bonds or GO bonds to finance specified projects or activities is defined to be a bond measure. And subsequent to their enactment, a general obligation bond, again, a GO bond, must actually be approved by the voters after the legislature. Another misconception is that double jointing amendments and contingent enactment amendments are the same thing. However, contingent enactment means that a section of a bill or an entire bill becomes operative only upon some contingency taking place, such as the enactment of another measure, an appropriation to be made in the budget bill, perhaps the adoption by the voters of a constitutional amendment. Double jointing amendments are the amendments that are made to two or more bills so that an amended bill does not override the provisions of another bill, or called chaptering out, where both bills propose to amend the same code section. These are often incorrectly referred as chaptering out amendments. Chaptering out is the problem that is addressed by the double jointing amendments. Another misconception is that a bill's legislative council's digest analyzes a bill's provisions. This digest, of course, is prepared by the Office of Legislative Counsel Attorneys. The digest summarizes existing law and what a bill proposes to do to existing law. It is required to appear on the first page of a printed bill, but it does not provide an analysis like a committee or floor analysis is done. That instead is completed by policy committee staff in their bill analyses. Another misconception is that the processes of engrossing and enrolling of bills is the same thing. When a bill is amended in the legislature, the printed form of the bill is proofread by staff to assure that the amendments are inserted properly into the bill. After it is proofread, the bill is deemed to be correctly engrossed and is deemed to be in proper form. Now, whenever a bill passes both houses of the legislature, it's then ordered to engrossing and enrolling. And in enrollment, the bill is again proofread for accuracy, and then it's delivered to the governor. And that enrolled bill contains the complete text of the bill with the dates of passage certified by the Secretary of the Senate, as well as the Chief Clerk of the Assembly, who sign each enrolled bill. Another misconception is that only bills can impose state mandates. State legislative enactments or administrative regulations can mandate a new program or a higher level of service on the part of a local government. The cost of these imposed mandates are required generally by the Constitution to be reimbursed to the local governments by the state. Another misconception is that local governments determine whether a bill creates a state mandated local program. So a bill is designated by the Office of Legislative Counsel Attorneys to be a state mandated local program, which requires the state to reimburse to the local governments the cost of activities required by legislative and executive acts. This reimbursement requirement was actually established in 1972 by SB 90, which was Chapter 1406. Moreover, the reimbursement requirement was ratified by the voters by a constitutional amendment, which was Proposition 4 at the November 1979 general election. Another misconception is that bills containing an urgency clause only require one vote for passage. A vote on the urgency clause, of course, requires a 2/3 vote in each house, and it must precede a vote on the bill, and that's pursuant to Joint Rule 27. So while one vote is announced on the floors of the Assembly and Senate, or one vote is taken, there are actually two votes. One is on the urgency clause, and the second is on the bill itself. And therefore, you'll hear the presiding officer in the Assembly or Senate on the floor say, AB 123, ayes 75, noes 5 on the urgency, ayes 75, noes 5 on the bill. That is a requirement of the state constitution that there be two votes. Another misconception is that assembly committees may reduce or introduce actually an unlimited number of bills each session. Under Assembly Rules 47D, subdivision D, unless the Rules Committee suspends it, the Budget Committee may introduce a bill germane to any subject within the jurisdiction of the Assembly Committee on Budget. Any other standing committee of the Assembly may introduce a total of 5 bills in each year of a 2-year legislative session. And of course, any of those committee bills have to be germane to subjects within the proper consideration of that standing committee. Another misconception is that Assembly committees may introduce resolutions and bills. Pursuant to Assembly Rule 47E, unless the Rules Committee suspends it, no committee except the Budget Committee can introduce or author a House resolution, a concurrent resolution, or even a joint resolution. Another misconception is that all measures that are reported out of a policy committee are placed on the second reading file. In the Assembly, pursuant to Assembly Rule 66, all bills reported out of the committees must be placed on the second reading file for the next legislative day. But this rule does not apply to joint or concurrent resolutions. Instead, it only applies to bills and constitutional amendments. Another misconception is that budget appropriations bills can be authored by any member. Bills providing for appropriations related to the budget can only be authored by the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee or the Assembly Budget Committee, and that's pursuant to Joint Rule 54. Now, this provision may be suspended by approval of the respective Rules Committee. Another misconception is that senators need to have a second in order to move a bill, just like in the Assembly. But in the Senate, to vote on a bill, it only requires the initial motion to move the bill. Again, in the Assembly, a motion and a second are required before a bill can actually be voted on by the committee. Another misconception is that a member of the legislature may not author a bill during a session that would have substantially the same effect as a bill that he or she introduced earlier in that same session. This is the general rule, unless the member receives approval by the Rules Committee. And despite that, pursuant to Joint Rule 54, that restriction on reintroduction does not apply in cases where the previously introduced bill was vetoed by the governor or where the provisions of that previously introduced bill were chaptered out by a later chaptered bill that session. And the final misconception is that any bill can be enacted to take care of a specific issue in a legislator's district. Under Article 4, Section 16 of the California Constitution, it provides that all laws of a general nature have uniform operation and apply throughout the state. And so it specifies that a local or special statute is invalid if a general statute can be made applicable.